was a kid, I would watch those old World War II newsreels of the Nazis marching and saluting Hitler, and I wondered, how is it possible that somebody who had such evil in his heart, how did he get so many people to agree with him? How did he get so many people to follow him? And I wondered what the theory would be. Was it money? Did all those was the economy so bad that the only way you could really make money was to be a soldier, and therefore, well, I don't want to go against the boss, otherwise I won't get my paycheck, or they'll kill me, or something of that nature. I don't know. And I think the other part of this is that we have to never forget how it came to be that somebody like Hitler came to power. You know, one of the things we do in this country, of all the things we probably get wrong, the one thing we get right is that we limit the presidency to 2 terms. Now, a lot can be done. A lot of damage can be done in 2 terms.
That's right. Don't
get me wrong, but at least it's not like Putin, where he wins the election, then you're kind of wondering, was there any question that he would win the election?
Exactly.
We don't even know what's going on over there. So let's talk about this a little bit with somebody who knows way more about it than I do. In fact, he's written an amazing book called The Death of Democracy. He is on the phone, Benjamin Carter Hett. He is, in addition to being a talented author, he's an attorney. He's a professor of history at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. The Death of Democracy, Hitler's Rise to Power, and the Downfall of the Weimar Republic. It is now on number 1. Let me look at my Amazon page real quickly. In the History of Germany category. That's by itself impressive, but it's also number 46 as a Kindle book.
Gosh.
In the Germany category, number 57. In the fascism category, and number 82 in the political science category. So it's doing really well, and it only came out like yesterday, I think.
Yeah, right? Isn't it amazing?
Yeah. Benjamin Carter Hett, good morning, sir. How are you?
Thank you. Good morning. I'm very well, thank you, and I'm delighted to be with you. And as a matter of fact, I hadn't looked at Amazon this morning, so I'm actually very glad to hear what you just reported. Thank you for that.
I bet you are. So what do you think is the interest? Do we see this happening in the world now, and is everybody reading this so they can kind of take notes and say, wait a minute, we got to be careful this doesn't happen again?
Well, you referred to Vladimir Putin, and I think you put it very well. I think you could say, wins the election, wins in quotation marks, the election in quotation marks.
Yeah.
I hear your point about term limits, but yes, I was actually just thinking a little bit before we started talking about how, when I was a relatively young man in the 90s, just after the fall of the Berlin Wall, things looked pretty cheerful in the world. A lot of nasty dictatorships ended. There was kind of this tide of democracy happening, and the future was looking a lot better. And now I think, sadly, we live in a lot darker time. And there are a lot of countries around the world, including some that had become democracies in the 90s, that are sliding back now, much like Germany did in the 20s and 30s. Russia is one, Hungary is one, Turkey. I mean, it sort of goes on and on. So, in part, yeah, I have been thinking these things over. But in part, this is what I do for a living. I've been studying the rise of the Nazis and writing about it for 17, 18 years or so. So this is sort of a continuation of something I've been doing for a while.
It is you that is our first defense. You and your colleagues, those who can write and write intellectually about these things. And of course, we have to thank the Founding Fathers for giving us the freedom of the press, because without those two things, freedom of the press and people writing, I think we'd have the blinders on pretty quickly.
Amen. I could not agree with you more. I'm the world's biggest First Amendment fan.
So and speaking of that, I mean, Hitler kind of gave us a clue. Well, how come we didn't read Mein Kampf and say, wait a minute, this guy's a nut? How is it possible?
Well, that's a great question. And, I teach classes on this. And I teach one class, for instance, where we talk specifically a lot about Hitler. And in fact, I assign my students a big chunk of Mein Kampf. And I always warn them ahead of time. I was kind of doing what you now call trigger warnings many years before anybody had that term. But I always warn the students, this book is really unpleasant. This is the nastiest book you could possibly imagine. But it's also really boring. I mean, you probably have never tried to plow through all 400 or 500 pages of Mein Kampf, and I would not recommend it if you're not a historian of this period. But it's super boring. I mean, Hitler was not a great writer. So, I mean, people didn't read it because it's a big slog through boring and unpleasant stuff. A few people did read it and said, hey, this guy looks like a problem. But then again, it's a politician's autobiography, and we know this today. How much are you going to believe in any politician's autobiography? And usually when they come into power, they do very different things anyway. So lots of people thought that about Hitler.
Well, that's fair to say. I think what happened was the conditions in Germany were so bad that they were ripe for being gullible. They wanted somebody who could be the savior of the country, and he seemed to be the best candidate, without looking deeper into whatever ideas he may have had. My grandparents were from Germany. They moved in 1925 because they saw things going sour. They got out of there. Yeah.
That was a good time to move. Yes. Well, you're absolutely right, and I think one thing that's important to understand, this is something I try to flesh out in the book, and that is that it's not like Hitler. When we look back, we know a lot of stuff that people did not know in the 1920s and 30s. It's not like Hitler stood up and said, support me and I will bring you the most devastating war in history, and I will bring you something you've never even heard of yet, which is called a genocide. And it's not like he said that. A lot of what he and his party said were, and this goes back to something you alluded to earlier, it goes back to trying to find solutions to the economic problems that Germany had at that time, which were off the charts awful. Just to give you a quick idea, in the year 1932, the official unemployment rate in Germany was 40%, 40. So there was, and long before even the Great Depression in 29, there was a lot of economic misery in Germany. Particularly, farmers were going bankrupt, and so there was a lot of rural poverty. And Hitler and his party seemed to be the guy, and his party seemed to be the people who actually were holding out what looked to a lot of people like solutions for all this misery.
Mm-hmm. And I know, too, when they were extending into Austria, when you brought up the economic impact, they were actually providing jobs. So people were happy. They were walking around. He was concentrating on schools, encouraging people to put their children in school and things, and it was like such a huge a shade that he put on that nobody really saw the real reason.
Yeah, that's right. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the Nazis had a document called the 25 Points. It was their official party platform. And if you read that, I always like to do this exercise with my students just to confuse them a little bit. But if you read that, not all of it sounds bad. I mean, some of it, just as you were saying, some of it, the Nazis wanted to provide better educational opportunity for poorer children. They wanted better old age pensions, better medical care. They advocated even profit sharing in big businesses. So there's a lot of this that doesn't quite fit with our sort of common image of what the Nazis were about. And that also helps us understand why people would support this party. The party was handing people things that, responded to needs.
So the other question is, why did they continue to support him when they saw their Jewish friends being forced to wear stars? Why, when they were seeing their Jewish friends being forced to close their businesses? I mean, how did that survive? Once that started happening, and it was obvious to everybody that something wrong was happening, but nobody stood up and said, hey, stop it.
Yeah, well, part of the answer there is timing. By the time Jewish people had to wear stars, that was 1941, Jewish businesses being closed down, that starts to happen in the later 30s. By that time, there's no democracy anymore. The last time Germans had a really free election was November 1932. And then after that, Hitler started, he was appointed chancellor in January 1933, and then after that, he very quickly started dismantling the democracy. So what you might have thought as a citizen, seeing what was happening to your Jewish neighbors wouldn't matter very much. But that also, this also gets into a huge, complicated question, which historians have spent a lot of time thrashing over, and that is that you have to keep in mind that German Jews made up a little under 1% of the German population. And it was very easy for people, and this is, I think, a human thing that happens all the time. It was very easy for people who weren't Jewish just to look the other way. Most people have other things in their lives. They have their family, they have their jobs, whatever. And, okay, something really bad's happening to your neighbor. If I speak out against it, I'm going to be in big trouble with the police. I'll just look the other way. And that's a very human reaction.
That is so sad. Yeah, I know. I don't disagree with you. I have to wonder how I would have behaved. I just don't think I would have put up with it. I would have probably been killed. I don't know.
And there were people who saw it and spoke out. And even before 33, one guy I write about a little bit in my new book, and I've written about before, one of the human beings I absolutely most admire ever, a young lawyer named Hans Litten, who in 1931 subpoenaed Hitler into a trial where a bunch of Nazi stormtroopers, thugs, were on trial for shooting up a dance hall, actually. And so Hans Litten subpoenaed Hitler and then cross-examined him for about 3 hours. And Litten was a brilliant lawyer, and he was about 27 years old at this time. And he cross-examined Hitler into the ground and humiliated him. And Litten thought that by doing this, he could expose the violence that was at the heart of what Hitler was about. And to an extent, he did. But tragically, not enough people paid attention. And then you might guess what happened to Litten. He was one of the first people arrested when Hitler was in power, and then he spent 5 years being brutally tortured and beaten and so on in concentration camps, and he finally died in a concentration camp in 1938, aged 34. Extraordinary man.
Yeah.
And then you also have the people that did put themselves on the line to protect their friends, even though they couldn't protect everyone. They could protect one or two or maybe one whole family, like in the case of Anne Frank.
Right, exactly. Yeah, there were such people. There were quite a few. It's sort of a glass half empty, glass half full thing. When human beings have to risk their lives to help somebody else, how many will volunteer to do that? I'm not quite sure what the answer to that's going to be anywhere, anytime, any place. A number of Germans did. Most didn't. And maybe that's about what you would expect most places.
And what you were saying about people turning a blind eye to what's actually happening, I mean, the United States government did that in the very beginning, before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. They wouldn't send anybody to help.
The United States government in the early and mid-30s was most concerned about getting Germany to pay its debts to the United States. If it was Hitler's government that was paying them, that was fine. But you're right, everybody did that. I mean, all world governments, the British, the French, it was the same thing.
If you could tie together what was happening in Germany in the 30s and early 40s with the economy of that nation, were the horrible things that we know actually helping build the economy? I hate to say there was a positive coming out of a negative, but did that happen?
Well, let me back up a little bit. So I think one of the most crucial, if not the most crucial explanations, to the question you raised at the outset of why it is that Hitler and his party could come into power, it very much has to do with the German economy. This was at a time when, coming out of World War I, the Germans were very vulnerable politically and economically, and Germany in the 20s and early 30s was really at the mercy economically of the countries that had won World War I, and it was sort of the German economy was getting hurt by a lot of global trade patterns and by technology coming into factories and eliminating jobs and so on. And that's what really helped to create a groundswell that ultimately is the thing that explained why Hitler got a lot of votes. Then if you move forward, so then Hitler's in power, and he understands pretty well that if the economy doesn't function better, he's probably going to be in political trouble. Even in a dictatorship, Nazi Germany was sort of, in a weird way, oddly democratic, at least in the sense that Hitler had to worry a lot about public opinion, because in a dictatorship, if the public opinion goes against you, it's not that you're going to lose an election, you're going to get overthrown and killed. So he knew the economy had to do better, but he also, his main priority was to build up the armed forces. So what Germany starts doing is developing its economy in a way that features and favors the sort of heavy industries that build armaments. And this starts to suck up the unemployed, so to speak. And in 1935, Germany then reintroduced a draft for the armed forces. That starts taking a lot of young men who had been unemployed and putting them into the army. So by 1938, Germany actually had a labor shortage, and that also explains a lot of why Hitler was able to kind of cement his control over the people.
So he was actually then trying to outsource jobs to other countries.
No, actually, he was trying to do the opposite.
Oh, okay.
He was as a matter of fact, one thing that I think is quite interesting is that even in the late 1920s, long before he was anywhere near power, Hitler complained about German companies outsourcing jobs. In fact, he complained specifically about German companies outsourcing jobs to China. He used the example of a ship manufacturer that starts building ships in China instead of in Germany, which, I think you read that and it's 1928 and you think, my goodness, is that 1928 or 2018?
Yeah,
but,
yeah. And that's is that part of the reason for writing the book, is so that we see something happening now that we need to pay attention to?
Well, I think I'm a historian. I just think these facts are striking and interesting.
Yeah.
But it relates to something that's very important about Hitler, and that he really wanted to actually cut Germany off economically from the rest of the world. His reason for this was really about sort of national security and wartime self-sufficiency. Germany had suffered a lot in World War I because of the British naval blockade, which basically cut Germany off from any imports. And so Hitler drew the lesson from that when we have another war, we need to not be depending on imports. So he was really geared towards trying to make the German economy self-sufficient, to not be exporting goods, to be using them at home, to not be importing goods, to be making them at home. And ultimately it explains his whole rationale for wanting to conquer territory in Eastern Europe so Germany would have a secure food supply.
If I could go back in time to the before the end of the war and when the Germans who were going along with Hitler, what kind of government would they say they had? They wouldn't call it a democracy. What would they call it?
They might, in a way, they might sort of say it's a democracy, or they might try to make the argument that it was, in fact, more democratic than the democracies they were at war with.
Oh, wow.
This is a claim that actually both Hitler and the equally undemocratic Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union made, that their regimes were really regimes of the people, whereas they would argue that the democracies of America and Britain were, their term for us was, a sort of plutocratic, elite-dominated undemocracy. But
wow.
The other answer to your question probably would be that if Germans liked what Hitler was doing, they would probably characterize it, and they would mean this positively, as an authoritarian regime more in keeping with German traditions than a Western-style democracy was.
What do your students say when they hear other people say that the Holocaust didn't happen? What kind of feedback do you get from them?
I'm not sure that's ever come up.
Oh, okay.
You don't do a talk show.
Because that's very, very unsettling when we hear people say that, and I didn't know how close that kind of statement is to the young people of today, your students.
Well, my students, I would be shocked beyond measure if more than 1 in 1,000 of my students was receptive to that kind of argument. I will say that in 1 or 2 of my classes, I commonly assign a really great book about a trial that happened 18 years ago in London, in which a sort of notorious Holocaust denier, a British guy named David Irving, lost a lawsuit against an American writer who had called him a Holocaust denier. And in losing this lawsuit, a lot of evidence came out which sort of demonstrated the lengths he went to falsify the historical record to, in fact, deny the Holocaust. I mean, he is, in fact, a Holocaust denier. And I assign this book to my students because I think it's a really good sort of example of how someone who wants to do something like deny the Holocaust, what they have to do to the vast array of evidence that is out there that these things happen.
Right, yeah. And you have to wonder, what's the point of denying it? What is the ultimate goal there? Do you know, one of the things that disgusts me is when I look at old footage and I can just feel the arrogance coming from people who in a way, I have a connection to it because of my grandparents having come from there. But my grandparents weren't of the mindset of these people who were so arrogant that truly believed that they were the superior race. It's just, I mean, the arrogance. Even the music disgusts me. You know?
Yeah.
I agree. That gets me too. The arrogance was based in something that was really a part of that time, and that's in a way that's quite different from our time, I think. But it was based in the really extreme racism that the Nazis had, exalting Germans as sort of the finest examples of humanity. And they were an extreme version of that, but one of the things that is unsettling, I think, when you read about the 1920s or 1930s is, although they were extreme, they were not so far away from how a lot of other people thought in the 1920s and 1930s. I mean, racism was kind of everywhere and kind of taken for granted. And if we can say that anything at all positive came out of this ghastly era, at least it was that the Nazis discredited racism, in the extreme brutality of their actions. What they made it, kind of impossible, or certainly much harder for sort of decent people to espouse racist ideas afterwards. It's no coincidence that you start seeing a big human rights movement and the civil rights movement and everything right in the aftermath of World War II.
And not just racism, but if a person of the race that Hitler wanted to be pure, the children were born with birth defects, he didn't want that either. He just took...
No, that's right. And that's also rooted in things that were common at the time and that we've sort of learned better. But, if you go back into the early 20th century, even in America or Britain or elsewhere, it was very common to think in terms of what people then called social hygiene or even racial hygiene. And part of it was this idea that people with handicaps of whatever kind need to be, removed from the population.
Yeah, I hate the term genetic cleansing.
Oh, yeah.
What?
Yeah.
That is what? Where'd that come from? What are you implying? Oh my gosh. The topic is so important to remember. I want to give the book away. You sent us a copy, and the rest of us will have to go buy it. If you're listening and you would like the one copy that was sent to me, you can have it if I answered the phone. So you have to call in. I'll answer the phone. The book is The Death of Democracy, written by our guest Benjamin Carter Hett, H-E-T-T. It's #1 right now on Amazon, and it just came out yesterday. So that's pretty amazing that you can have that accomplishment. You don't even have one review yet. You don't have any reviews, but you're #1. Don't you find that amazing?
I was hoping people might have been reading it overnight, and
it's amazing. I mean, look at all the books in this category too. So you've jumped to the top on this one. Let me give the book away, and then we'll see if there's any websites and kind of that kind of stuff. Good morning. You've got the book. Who's this?
Hey, it's Dee. I'd love it. Thank you.
You've got it, Dee. It'll be waiting for you here at the station.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, I mentioned Amazon. Do you have a website you want to mention, Benjamin?
I think it's available on all the sort of ordinary book websites. Amazon, certainly, Barnes & Noble. I think it should be in stores, too.
Okay, so you don't have a website for yourself, for your writing?
Oh, I personally have a website, but not one through which I sell books.
Oh, okay. Okay, gotcha. Okay.
This must have been a very emotional project for you, sir.
Yes, it is. It is. Working on this whole era is. There are times, I'll be honest with you, there are times when I read some of these sources or when I'm writing something that I'll get choked up and I need to go take a break.
Do you know, when I was a kid, I had a Jewish friend, and we would walk to school together, and I'm talking elementary school. And so we were just learning about World War II. And I keep in mind, I'm talking about the early 60s. So it wasn't that long before then that this all happened. And we're learning about Hitler. We're learning about Germany. And then I'm walking on the streets of Long Island, New York with my Jewish friend.
You're like 7 or something?
Maybe 10.
Oh.
Yeah. And my friend Bobby Coleman says to me, "Your people killed my people." And I said, "Oh my gosh, really? I'm so sorry." It is. I mean, but it is really true. I mean, not that my people did, literally, but anyway, we are going to repeat things if we don't remember the bad stuff. So, That's why I think books like this is so important. That's why historians who can accurately tell a story are so important. Benjamin, thank you for being one of those people.
Well, thank you, and it's been a really great pleasure talking to you.
Very good. Good luck with everything, and come back with whatever you write next.
I will be happy to do that.
All right, we'll be right back. This is The Source, WOCA Ocala.
Broadcasting from the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
Fox News Radio, I'm Lillian Wu. The family of the woman who shot and injured 3 at YouTube headquarters yesterday before killing herself says they warned police she might have had a plan to do harm there. Nasim Agdam's family reporting her missing, then getting a call. Police found her in